If you are ready, we will get going. All set. The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2E and House Rule 112H4, the Chair announces that he may postpone roll call votes. Today, we meet to consider H.R. 2763, the Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer Improvements Act of 2017. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 2763, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2763, a bill to amend the Small Business Act to improve the Small Business Innovation Research Program and Small Business Technology Transfer Program, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and I'll recognize myself for an opening statement. First of all, I want to thank the gentleman from California, Mr. Knight, for introducing this legislation, which makes key improvements to the SBIR and STTR programs. The SBIR program was signed into law by President Reagan in 1982 to help spur innovation and increase small business participation in federal research and development activity. Since its inception, this competitive grant program has funded more than 100,000 projects across America and has helped spawn familiar companies such as Qualcomm, Sonicare, and Symantec. SBIR and STTR award winners also have created innovations critical to our national science and security efforts, such as parts for the Mars rover for NASA and a unique cockpit airbag system to protect Army helicopter pilots. Today, 11 federal agencies provide funding to small businesses through SBIR, and 5 agencies provide funding through STTR, a total of nearly $3 billion this fiscal year. That's over 66 times greater than the $45 million spent under the original program in 1983. Grant recipients have contributed to the country's scientific and technical knowledge, generating hundreds of patents and many contributions to applied science and knowledge. These small businesses have expanded innovation and helped strengthen our economy by creating jobs, thousands of good-paying jobs every year. However, as we heard at a joint hearing conducted with the Small Business Committee last month, there is still room for improvement. For example, the General Accountability Office's recent review of SBIR and STTR raised red flags about irregular and incomplete reports to Congress by the SBA and participating agencies. These are not new problems, and given the exponential growth in the program, it is long past time for them to be remedied. These assessment tools are crucial to ensure that taxpayers get maximum returns on their investment. We also need to keep in mind that these programs are intended to support innovators and entrepreneurs engaged in early-stage research and development. We need to update SBIR and STTR in order to reflect a fast-changing business environment. Deficiencies in SBIR, STTR efficiency and effectiveness mean lost opportunities for innovative small enterprises. The legislation before our committee addresses both of these needs, and I congratulate Mr. Knight for developing such a responsible, forward-looking bill. It is appropriate to note that Mr. Knight also serves on the Small Business Committee as chairman of the Subcommittee on Contracting and Workforce, which shares jurisdiction over SBIR and STTR. He was a leader for the timely reauthorization of the SBIR and STTR programs last year, which assured no interruption in federal support for continuing innovation and commercialization from taxpayer-supported basic research. Last week, the House Small Business Committee unanimously approved an amended version of H.R. 2763. Today, I look forward to considering a handful of good reform and prioritization amendments, followed by our committee's approval, which will move this legislation one step closer to House floor action and eventual enactment. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Eddie Bernice Johnson, for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup of H.R. 2763, the Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer Improvement Act of 2017. H.R. 2763 was introduced and previously marked up by our colleagues on the Small Business Committee. This morning, members of the Science Committee have the opportunity to debate and amend this important legislation. The Small Business Innovation Research Program, or the SBIR, was created in by Congress in 1982 Since then, it has grown in size from $45 million to over $2.2 billion and expanded to include Small Business Technology Transfer, or the STTR program. The mission of SBIR program is fourfold: to stimulate technological innovation, to use small businesses to help meet federal research and development needs, to increase private sector commercialization of the results of federally funded research, and to foster the participation of women and minority-owned firms in technological innovation. I believe the evidence shows that SBIR to be an extremely valuable program that we must continue to support and strengthen. However, I continue to believe we must consider the SBIR in the context of our broader federal R&D investments. In December 2016, Congress provided certainty for the SBIR program for the next 5 years by extending its authorization to fiscal year 2022 at the current allocation level. I was pleased that we were able to accomplish that small but important task. As grant proposal success rates at NSF and NIH link to historical lows for some programs, we should be very wary of any actions that would further destabilize the basic research enterprise that serves as a foundation for our nation's innovation and economic growth. I would be very happy to see SBIR and STTR grow in addition to funding for federal R&D overall. And I'm eager to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make that happen. I will also note that SBIR programs has been evaluated in 2 rounds of reports by the national academies. Overall, the academies have found that agencies are meeting the first 3 objectives of the program, but falling short on the 4th objective of expanding participation of women and minorities. We must continue to push agencies on this objective. Our nation's capacity to innovate will deteriorate rapidly if we keep excluding large and growing percentage of our population from technological innovation and entrepreneurship. This morning, members on both sides are preparing to offer substantive amendments to the Small Business Committee's introduced bill. We will then have to reconcile any differences with the Small Business Committee's amendments. While there will be policy issues on which we have disagreements, H.R. 2763 is a good bill, and I'm pleased to be able to work closely with the chairman and my other Republican colleagues to advance it. I believe we can get to an agreement with the Small Business Committee and bring this bill to the House floor. I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup and making this a bipartisan, transparent process. I hope we can be more of this in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Ms.
Dave.
Johnson, for that nice opening statement. The gentleman from California, Mr. Knight, the author of the bill, is recognized for an opening statement as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 2763 is a bipartisan bill that amends the Small Business Act to improve the Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR, and Small Business Technology Transfer, STTR, programs. Small businesses drive our economy and are key to America's global leadership in innovation. Small businesses are more nimble, can respond to market changes more rapidly than bigger counterparts, and make the United States more agile in the world economy. The SBIR and STTR programs have proven to be very successful at driving small business participation in federal R&D activities and solving government agency problems, from protecting our soldiers in the field to helping eradicate malaria. Last year, the Science Small Business Committees worked with the House and Senate Armed Services Committees to include a 5-year extension of the SBIR and STTR programs. This provided small businesses and the participating agencies alike with the confidence and security to know that these popular programs will continue to be there through 2022. Last month, the Small Business Subcommittee on Contracting and Workforce that I chair held a joint hearing with the Science, Research, and Technology Subcommittee to look at recommendations for making minor adjustments to improve SBIR and STTR. H.R. 2763 takes some of those recommendations and strengthens the programs in 5 ways. First, the bill insists on agency accountability. including several hard reporting deadlines for participating agencies and for the Small Business Administration, SBA, to provide Congress with better information and a greater grasp of the program's strengths and weaknesses. Second, the legislation clarifies the congressional intent of the previous reauthorization to ensure that taxpayers reap the benefit of SBIR and STTR programs by tying them to long-term projects at the DoD. Third, the legislation extends a popular pilot program that would allow all participating agencies to award a Phase 2 contract if the agency finds that the small business concern has already completed work typically done in that Phase 1. Fourth, it makes permanent the option for participating agencies to establish commercialization readiness programs, CRPs. As a pilot program, CRPs have shown to provide much-needed assistance to small firms nearing the completion of the process and have helped advance technology to commercialization phase. And lastly, it extends a provision to allow participating agencies to utilize 3% of their allocation for administrative functions that increase waste, fraud, and abuse efforts and conduct outreach in an effort to bring more companies into SBIR and STTR world. It's important to note that while SBIR and STTR programs provide an average of $3 billion in awards to small firms annually, it does so without a direct appropriations. These programs simply provide that approximately 3.65% of already appropriated extramural R&D dollars be provided for small businesses through these programs. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both the Science Committee and the Small Business Committee to refine the bill and to move it to the floor for a vote. I want to thank the Chairman of Small Business, Chairman Shabbat, Chairman Smith, for his leadership in supporting this opportunity, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Knight. We will now proceed with amendments in the order listed on the roster. The first amendment is a manager's amendment, and the clerk will report it.
Amendment to H.R. 2763, offered by Mr. Smith of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and I'll recognize myself to explain the amendment. This amendment includes several amendments that the Small Business Committee unanimously approved during their markup of H.R. 2763 last week. The amendment includes provisions that, 1, clarify reporting deadlines and ensure Congress receives agency reports at the same time as the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. 2, helps SBIR and STTR grantees by increasing the portion of their award available for taking their ideas from concept to commercialization, creating more flexibility in funding guidelines for technical and business assistance grants, and expanding the number of local vendors eligible to provide services to awardees. And 3, requires the Department of Defense to report to Congress any goals and incentives they devise to boost inclusion of SBIR and STTR developed technologies into larger programs of record. This amendment includes many good bipartisan efforts to improve the SBIR and STTR programs and strengthens the underlying bill. I urge my colleagues to support the manager's amendment. Is there any further discussion on the manager's amendment? The gentleman from yes is recognized, Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in favor of the manager's amendment. Just quickly, the second provision that you mentioned that was added in the Small Business Committee is the Support Startup Businesses Act of 2017, or Startup Act, which I introduced with Representatives Lujan and Schneider 2 weeks ago. It enjoys support in both the House and the Senate. It would increase the cap of the amount of each SBIR and STTR award that can be used for technical assistance. So I think it's very important to be able to pay for things like market research, intellectual property protection, or participation in entrepreneurial training programs like I-Corps. So it lets small businesses use their funds where they know they're needed the most. And so I think this would be very helpful to those who receive these grants. So I thank the chairman for the manager's amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. And if there are no further discussion on the amendment, the question is on agreeing to the manager's amendment. All in favor say aye. And opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk. And does the gentleman wish to be recognized?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2763, offered by Mr. Loudermilk of Georgia, amendment number 001.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment seeks to focus the attention of the new administrator of the Small Business Administration on the fact that the SBA has failed to submit its statutorily required annual SBIR STTR report to Congress since 2014. The amendment simply states that if the SBA fails to submit the reports on time, the administrator's travel budget is frozen unless a statutorily required annual report is submitted to Congress. At the SBIR STTR hearing several weeks ago, the GAO witness highlighted the SBA's failure to provide objective information to Congress as a major impediment to informed decision-making and a liability in terms of congressional oversight of possible waste, fraud, and abuse. I recognize this amendment is a big hammer. However, I think it shows Congress is serious about its oversight role and statutory authority, no matter which party is in charge of the administration. I ask my colleagues to support me in this amendment to protect and preserve the authority of Congress. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Loudermilk, and I'll recognize myself in support of the amendment. Under the previous administration, the SBA ignored a statutory mandate to report annually to Congress on the SBIR and STTR programs so that we can monitor their progress and conduct oversight. I trust under the new administration and under the leadership of the new SBA administrator, the reports will be on time. But if not, this amendment gives the SBA plenty of incentive to follow the law. And I recognize my colleagues support the amendment as well. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If not, all in favor say aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holtgren, and he is recognized for that purpose.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2763, offered by Mr. Holtgren of Illinois, amendment number 019.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment encourages manufacturing innovation in the United States by requiring federal agencies to give a high priority to the SBIR and STTR programs to small businesses engaged in manufacturing R&D for the purpose of developing and producing new products and technologies in the United States. American manufacturing means jobs. A thriving manufacturing sector is vital to our economy, putting people to work and driving growth. 10% of all Illinois workers are involved in manufacturing, and 12.4% of Illinois' gross domestic product is attributable to manufacturing, making up the largest share of Illinois GDP. Manufacturing facilities employ more than 27,000 workers across the 14th Congressional District of Illinois, which I represent. The United States must continue to innovate manufacturing operations, techniques, and specialized products to remain globally competitive. Making manufacturing innovation a high priority in the SBIR and STTR programs is just one way that Congress can take action to spur the manufacturing sector. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your support of the amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Holtgren, and I'll recognize myself in support of the amendment, though my comments may not be quite so Illinois-centric as the gentleman's were. American innovation in manufacturing is critical to our economy and to creating the jobs of the future. The SBIR and STTR program should make it a priority to encourage production in the U.S. and support new and innovative methods and products for manufacturing. So I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? And if not, the question is on agreeing to the Holtgren amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Up next is an amendment to be offered by the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, and he is recognized for that purpose.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2763, offered by Mr. Higgins of Louisiana, amendment number 016.
And without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. My amendment ensures that federal agencies give high priority to small businesses that are engaged in cybersecurity research and development for awarding SBIR and STTR grants. Every day, the American government and U.S. businesses are under attack from cyber threats. Cyber criminals and foreign adversaries spend every hour of every day trying to steal our valuable personal and government information. We must use every tool in our arsenal to prevent, mitigate, and defend against these attacks. Small businesses and startups are where some of the most innovative ideas and products exist for cyber warfare. My amendment ensures that federal government is harnessing and that expertise through the SBIR and STTR programs to meet one of the greatest security challenges of the 21st century. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to offer this amendment, and I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Higgins. By the way, we need to get you some company on the front row there. I'll recognize myself in support of your amendment. I support the gentleman's amendment and thank him for his leadership on cyber and other national security issues. Cybersecurity is a critical national priority, and federal agencies should tap the SBIR and STTR programs to find solutions. Not all federal agencies involved in the SBIR and STTR programs have cybersecurity in their missions, so I think we can work with our colleagues on the Small Business Committee to refine the language before the bill goes to the floor. So I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Is there any further discussion? And if not, all in favor of Mr. Higgins' amendment, say aye. No. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Up next is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski, and the gentleman is recognized for that purpose.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2763, offered by Mr. Lipinski of Illinois, amendment number 025.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment would build on the SBIR STTR program by requiring that funds be directed for a proof of concept partnership pilot program, essentially a pilot for SBIR Phase 0. The program would provide grants to innovative technology transfer programs at universities, research institutes, and national laboratories. There are many reasons why scientists may not take the initial steps to see if their invention or concept has the potential commercialization. They may lack sufficient funding, business expertise, or they may not have considered the possibility that their invention has commercial potential. These limitations stand in the way of scientists and engineers collaborating with businesses or investors to take their ideas to the next level. This amendment would provide funding for programs that, among other things, actively seek out scientific discoveries with commercial potential, fund technology acceleration and validation, and provide entrepreneurial education to scientists and engineers. These efforts will improve the commercialization rate of federal R&D, which in turn will create jobs and strengthen the economy. This amendment was formally introduced as the Technology and Research Accelerating National Security and Future Economic Resiliency, or Transfer Act, in the 113th Congress by Mr. Collins of New York and Mr. Kilmer of Washington, and passed through this committee with bipartisan support, but it was never enacted into law. Prior to the Transfer Act and the 2011 SBIR reauthorization, I sponsored a provision to create a Phase 0 pilot program at NIH. The NIH Centers for Accelerated Innovations and Research Evaluation and Commercialization Hubs, or REACH programs, are funded by this pilot program. And we heard about these during the hearing that we held on the reauthorization of this legislation of SBIR and STTR. The REACH program created 3 centers in Kentucky, Minnesota, and New York. In their first 2 years, the 3 centers have produced 30 patent applications filed, 14 technology licenses negotiated, 7 companies formed, 53 SBIR STTR proposals submitted, and 70 promising technologies in the pipeline. Perhaps more important than these numbers, though, are the regional innovation ecosystems these universities are helping to build. This amendment would help greatly expand the number of these types of successful centers around the country. A number of organizations, including the National Venture Capital Association, have expressed support for the Transfer Act. So I urge the adoption of this amendment, which I think would be greatly helpful to the SBIR STTR program and to American innovation, and I yield back.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Lipinski, and I'll recognize myself in support of the amendment. And I appreciate Mr. Lipinski's work on this issue over a long period of time. The amendment is based on the Transfer Act, a bipartisan bill that the Science Committee has passed twice. The Transfer Act helps American taxpayers see a greater return on their federal R&D investments by closing the gap between federally funded R&D efforts and the commercialization of new products and technologies. This means new products, technologies, and medicines can be brought to market faster, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If not, the ranking member, Ms. Johnson, is recognized.
Well, thank you. I will, Mr. Chairman. I'll make my remarks very brief and simply say that I do support the transfer of this innovative technologies from lab to the market. It's a good idea. I supported the last one and I ask all of us to support the amendment.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. The question is on the amendment. All in favor, say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment is also by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski, and he is recognized for that purpose.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2763, offered by Mr. Lipinski of Illinois, amendment number 035.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The National Science Foundation's Innovation Corps I-Corps program was created administratively by NSF in 2011 and authorized through language I authored in the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act that became law last year. The I-Corps program offers valuable entrepreneurial education to scientists and engineers who are college research faculty, graduate students, and postdoctoral fellows. The purpose is to help these individuals develop new, innovative products from the world-class research they have conducted in their labs. As everyone on this committee knows, I've been an evangelist for I-Corps for the past 7 years. The program has had tremendous success through the NSF and has been expanded to other agencies, including DOE, NIH, DOD, USDA, and DHS. It has helped create new entrepreneurs and new tech jobs, and is helping federal taxpayers get the most out of their investment in research. The current I-Corps program is successful in part to its focus on providing specific types of education and mentoring that budding entrepreneurs need at this initial stage when they are first attempting to create a product based on research they have conducted in the lab. But different types of support are needed at later stages as a small business attempts to establish itself and progress toward the market. These later stages would be where a small business would be applying for an SBIR, STTR Phase 1 or Phase 2 grant. To help provide the needed assistance for small businesses receiving grants in these phases, my amendment directs the NSF to create I-Corps Phase 1 and Phase 2. We know that there are existing business accelerators, university technology transfer programs, and training programs carried out by NSF and other federal agencies that provide excellent templates for how to train and support early and mid-stage companies in achieving growth, scale, and market entry. If my amendment were added to this bill, NSF would convene experts from around the country and from a wide range of academic, industry, and government sectors to assemble model curriculum for Phase 1 and 2 assistance by taking advantage of the best practices and lessons learned from existing programs. This training would be paid for out of the SBIR, STTR grants, and only when the grant recipients believe this type of training would provide a better chance for the business to be successful. That is, it would not be required of all grantees. The creation of I-Corps Phase 1 and Phase 2 could be a big boost to the goal of the SBIR program by helping small businesses create new jobs and helping taxpayers get a better return on their investments than SBIR, STTR grants. This is something everyone can and should support. However, the chairman has expressed a desire to have a broader discussion on this issue and to gather more information before moving forward. So at his request, I'm willing to withdraw this amendment as long as the chairman gives me his assurance that we will have a hearing on this topic hopefully soon, September, and then moving forward legislatively on this issue. So I thank the chairman, and we'll yield to the chairman.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. Let me comment on the amendment and then respond to your suggestion as well. I appreciate your leadership and support of the I-Corps program. We do need to work with the National Science Foundation and external stakeholders on how to best leverage and build on the program's success. I look forward to working with the gentleman about holding a hearing to elicit ideas on how to strengthen the I-Corps program, encourage more entrepreneurs and startups, and create jobs. So I thank the gentleman for working with us on this issue and appreciate his anticipated withdrawal of the amendment.
But what about that hearing?
I will assure the gentleman that we will have a hearing either this millennium, this century, this decade, this year, this fall, and possibly in September.
I hope that possibly is a little stronger than that, and if it is, I guess right now I'll ask unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lipinski. Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. All righty. Okay, the next amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, and he is recognized.
I thank the chairman. I've got an amendment at the
The
desk.
clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2763, offered by Mr. McNerney of California, amendment number 049.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from California is recognized to explain his amendment.
Well, thank you. One of the 4 objectives that Congress had in mind in establishing the SBIR program was to facilitate the increase of participation by minority and disadvantaged persons in the technological innovation process. To date, 11 federal agencies participating in the SBIR program have had participation from minority-owned businesses vary significantly from year to year. We need to address this inequity. My amendment requires participating federal agencies to conduct outreach to minority-serving institutions and the faculty that conduct research at those institutions. By doing so, we can enhance awareness and opportunities for minorities and disadvantaged persons about the benefits and participates and partnerships available through the SBIR and STTR programs. My amendment uses the definition under SBA that's been in place for decades and is widely accepted. There are a great many minority-serving institutions and researchers who work at these institutions across the country. MSIs serve high concentrations of minority students who have historically been underrepresented in higher education. For example, CSU Stanislaus in my district is a minority-serving institution, has been ranked as one of the best colleges in our nation. Our country depends on innovation of MSIs and intellectual capital of its graduates. In the 21st century, the growth of the American economy is increasingly going to be determined by the proliferation and innovation of technology and STEM-focused businesses. We should seek ideas and partnerships across the nation, not limiting opportunities. It's critical to the growth of our economy that minority-owned businesses are connected to the technological ecosystem. Basically, this amendment is simple. It just requires outreach to minority-serving institutions, so there's consistent participation. It makes sense. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McNerney. I'll recognize myself in opposition to the amendment, but before I go into my objections, I wonder if the gentleman from California would consider withdrawing the amendment with this assurance that I am almost 100% confident we are going to be able to agree on language between now and the House floor, because we've had similar language in past bills that this committee has considered. As the gentleman knows, we had a compromise that we were discussing. We really ran out of time before we could reach an agreement on the language. But again, I'm fairly confident that we can reach an agreement between now and the House floor, and would like not to oppose the gentleman's amendment in detail right now unless he insists on it. And the gentleman is recognized to respond.
Well, I thank the chairman for the offer, and I appreciate the effort that's been made. I want to continue that on a bipartisan basis. I think we had a little trouble with a couple of our definitions, and I just want to make sure that the chairman understands that those are critical. They've been in use for decades, and we need to be careful when we tread down that path.
I certainly understand that.
All right, well, with the chairman's agreement in hand or cooperation in hand, I will agree to withdraw the amendment.
Okay, thank you. With that objection, the amendment is withdrawn. And again, Mr. McNerney, I'm sure that we can reach some agreement on acceptable language that will be bipartisan.
All right, Mr. Chairman, with unanimous consent, I ask to
Thank you,
withdraw the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. McNerney. The final amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, and he is recognized for that purpose.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2763, offered by Mr. Tonko of New York, amendment number 010.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment expresses a sense of Congress that agencies should consider providing additional support for the SBIR and STTR programs. The SBIR and STTR programs are of utmost importance to our nation. I am pleased to see the committee preserve and improve upon these critical programs. I, along with millions of our fellow Americans, recognize the value of innovative research. I will continue to fight to strengthen funding for agencies that support such cutting-edge research, and by extension, funding for the SBIR and STTR programs. These programs have a proven record driving innovation that has played a major role in American job creation, increased productivity, and United States global competitiveness. These programs have proven to be among the most successful drivers of technological innovation in our nation's history, delivering more than 70,000 patents and revolutionary achievements in agriculture, in defense, in energy, health sciences, homeland security, space transportation, and other fields. Thanks to Phase 1 and Phase 2 SBIR, countless jobs have been created in my own capital region of New York. Programs such as SBIR have helped our region give birth to a boom in high technology innovation and economic development. Numerous reviews by the national academies have found that the SBIR and STTR programs are achieving their ambitious objectives of stimulating technological innovation, increasing small business participation in the federal R&D enterprise, and increasing the commercialization of federally funded research and development. In fact, the National Academy surveys of SBIR STTR Phase 2 awardees over a 10-year period found that 27% of sales from National Institutes of Health funded technologies and 36% of sales from National Science Foundation technologies generated more than $1 million in revenue. Demand for the popular and highly competitive SBIR program remains high. At the National Science Foundation, only 17.2% of Phase 1 proposals are funded, and at the National Institutes of Health, only 12.6% of Phase 1 proposals are funded. For these reasons and more, I ask that you support this sense of Congress. To the extent it does not undermine other research and development programs, agencies should consider providing additional support for the SBIR and STTR programs, especially in technology areas that are high priority for an agency's mission as well as for our nation's economy. Agencies are already able to provide additional support. This amendment encourages them to do so in cases where it would not undermine other research and development programs. This is non-binding language. It simply encourages agencies to consider providing additional support for these very successful programs. I recently held a roundtable in my district with SBIR and STTR recipients who expressed the extraordinary value of these programs. I promised that I would do all that I can to support these critical programs, a promise I intend to keep. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this simple, sense of Congress amendment to show our strong commitment to the SBIR and STTR programs. With that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko, and I'll need to recognize myself in opposition to the amendment, but let me say that I appreciate both the amendment, I appreciate the gentleman's intent, and I appreciate his desire to want to increase funding for these two great programs. However, I need to oppose the amendment. Both SBIR and STTR receive all of their funding from federal agencies' research budgets. SBIR began with a deduction of 0.2% from agencies' research budgets. The SBIR allocation from basic research is now 3.2%, or 16 times higher. Today, 11 federal agencies provide funding to small businesses through SBIR, and 5 agencies provide funding through STTR, a total of nearly $3 billion this year. That's over 66 times greater than the $45 million spent under the original program in 1983, or an average increase of almost 200% per year. There are other committees in the House and Senate that wanted to increase the set-asides in the last reauthorization. Science Committee Republicans and Democrats last year stood together to oppose the increase in the set-asides and protect funding for basic and fundamental research. So I can't support the amendment that increases the set-asides for SBIR and STTR, which is at the expense of federal basic research budgets. In other words, I could support it, but I don't want to cut the basic research, and I hope you understand that's the reason and nothing more. So I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, even though, as I say, it's well-intended. And if there was another way to fund it without taking it out of basic research, I'd support the resolution. But I need to oppose it at this point. Are there other members who wish to be recognized to discuss the amendment? The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
And gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I strongly support the SBIR program and would like to see it grow. Like Mr. Tonko, I would like to see it grow along with growing budgets for all of our important research and development programs. Unfortunately, under this administration, critical science and technology investments at many of our agencies are under threat, which I believe really is the future of this nation to make sure that we have strong research and development. The Trump administration is even proposing to cut NIH by 20%, the National Science Foundation by 11%. Never before have I seen such draconian cuts from any administration, Democrat or Republican. I have confidence that Congress will reject many of these harmful proposals, but I worry that even Congress will not do enough to ensure continued U.S. leadership in science and technology. This is simply a sense of Congress. Mr. Tonko lays out a strong case for why the SBIR program is a valuable part of our overall federal R&D portfolio, and I associate myself with those comments. I supported the 2011 SBIR and STTR reauthorization bill that included a 30% increase for the programs. The SBIR and STTR programs are currently authorized through fiscal year 2022 at a combined set-aside level of 3.65%. Given our current budget environment, I supported and continue to support the flat 5-year extension included in last year's National Defense Authorization Act, and I do not believe we should revisit the terms of that agreement. Mr. Tonko's amendment includes a non-binding sense of Congress that agencies should consider increasing their investments in the SBIR program without undermining other R&D programs. There may be some procurement agencies that would see a net benefit from voluntarily increasing their support by SBIR in technology areas relevant to their own mission. For other agencies, especially the basic research agencies, the trade-off involves an increasing support for small business R&D and may not make, as I said in my opening statement, our basic research enterprise is already at risk due to flat or decreasing funding and historically low proposal success rates. The 17.2% success rate for National Science Foundation's SBIR Phase 1 grants, as described in Mr. Tonko's amendment, is troubling. Unfortunately, it is equal to or higher than the proposed success rates across most of the engineering directorate or at NSF. Other research programs at NSF are even worse off. We cannot afford to take any actions that would further destabilize the basic research foundation upon which our entire innovation economy is built. I want to thank Mr. Tonko for his carefully considered amendment, and I believe if it strikes the right balance of supporting the SBIR programs without doing any harm to any important Federal Reserve programs, I support this amendment and encourage my colleagues to do the same. This is simply a sense of Congress. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Any other member wish to speak on this amendment? And if not, the question is on who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chair, if I might.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
You know, just like the global race on space in the 60s, which required our total investment and focus in a bipartisan way to achieve victory, as we did in 1969 by landing an American as the first on the moon, we're in the midst of an innovation global race. And I think that this committee is assigned the awesome responsibility of recognizing the tools that we need in the kit for our industries and our nation to grow successfully in this innovation race. I think the statement here made by the committee is just that it's the sense of Congress. We would be recognized as partners with the agencies to say we do all that we can to provide the resources we need for SBIR and STTR. When I had my roundtable with the recipients from those two programs in my district, most recently, they raised the issue that they go to international conferences. And because these two programs are so successful, other nations are setting up like programs. And they're going to go beyond what we're funding here, and we're going to lose intellect and we're going to lose innovation if we don't invest and at least encourage it. It should be this committee's mission to say we can do better, we must do better. With that, I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield to me before he yields back?
Yes, sir.
I just want to make 2 points, and I don't know that I disagree with a single word that the gentleman said, and said well. My objections are that the funding for these programs have been increasing, as I mentioned a while ago, at almost 200% per year. And any money, additional money that goes to these two programs is going to come out of basic research, and I do not want to see that cut at all. And so I'll be happy to yield to the gentleman.
Yes, thank you. We should also see it as our responsibility to suggest that perhaps these agencies need more dollars. Caving in here because we're limiting ourselves when we have an opportunity to raise that limitation that's been imposed. I'm really concerned about where this administration is taking us in the midst of an innovation economy. It's about research, it's about innovation, and if we're taking those tools away, those investments away, if we're dumbing down, this should be an encouragement from this committee to say we need to do more at these agencies that are in the midst of an innovation economy. We're transitioning into something brand new here, and now's not the time to just dip our toe in the water and walk away. We need to plunge into it and give the private sector the tools it needs and the partnership it requires.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Tonko.
Chairman.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, is recognized.
Let me just note, and I respect the gentleman's opinion, and I know that there's a difference in approach between the different two sides of the aisle, but we can respect each other, and I do respect the idea that we need to spend more. That's the concept. We hear it often on just about every subject. Let me just note that on this side of the aisle, we generally say we don't need to spend more, we need to spend better. We need to be more cognizant of the value of what we're doing, and we need to make sure that we are fine-tuning this so that the money that is being spent is being taken out of other areas of our economy. It's being spent for its best possible purpose. So I would support the chairman's opposition, but respecting the other side, who obviously you have a desire to achieve the best goals for our country, and so do we. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrbacher. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Tonko. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
Mr. Chair?
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not.
Mr. Chair? I ask for a recorded vote,
Recorded
please.
vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll. Mr.
Mr.
Perlmutter requested two. No, oh. Okay. The clerk will call the roll. Thanks.
Mr. Smith.
No.
Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Lucas. No. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Rohrbacher. No. Mr. Rohrbacher votes no. Mr. Brooks. No. Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Holtgren. No. Mr. Holtgren votes no. Mr. Posey. No. Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Bridenstine. Mr. Weber. No. Mr. Weber votes no. Mr. Knight. Mr. Knight votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes no. Mrs. Comstock. Mrs. Comstock votes no. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Mr. Abraham. Mr. Abraham votes no. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood votes no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall votes no. Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn votes no. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Johnson votes aye. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Ms. Bonamici. Mr. Barra. Mr. Barra votes aye. Ms. Esty. Ms. Esty votes aye. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes aye. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer votes aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes aye. Mr. Foster? Ms. Hanabusa? Mr. Christ? Mr. Christ votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye.
Are there any members who wish to cast their vote or change their vote? And if not, the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 14 members voted aye, 18 members voted nay.
Okay, the nays have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized to cast a late vote, as long as it's no. Okay. Yeah, Dr. Foster will be recorded as having voted aye. If there are no further amendments, a reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 2763 to the House as amended with the recommendation that the bill be approved. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 2763 to the House as amended. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. H.R. 2763 is ordered reported to the House, and I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you all for a great attendance today, a great discussion on an important bill, and we stand adjourned.